The air was thin and tasted of clinical precision. He opened his eyes to a ceiling so white it burned, a void of color that matched the emptiness in his mind. There was no memory of how he had arrived in this sterile box, only the rhythmic hum of a ventilation system that sounded like a mechanical heartbeat. His limbs felt heavy, anchored to the bed by a weight that wasn't physical, until he looked down. Resting squarely against his chest was a weathered, dark leather ledger. Its skin was cracked with age, smelling of old dust and dried ink. When he touched it, a spark of static electricity jumped to his fingertips, a jolting reminder that he was alive, even if he didn't know who he was supposed to be. He flipped the cover open. Inside, written in a hand that felt hauntingly familiar, were names, hundreds of them, friends, teachers, rivals, and family. Next to every name was a staggering numerical value and a date of expiration that pulsed with a faint ghostly light. The numbers were millions, sometimes billions. As he scrolled, a cold realization settled in his gut. The prosperity of the city outside, the soaring skyscrapers and digital empires had been built on him. He was the silent creditor of the modern world, the unknowingly generous soul whose loans had funded every success story. The total sum at the bottom was a number so large it didn't seem real, a balance that the world could never hope to repay in one lifetime. His first target was a name that burned brighter than the others: Julian. He had been his closest confidant, the brother he chose. Now, Julian was a tech mogul, living in a glass and steel fortress that pierced the clouds. He left the room, finding that the heavy security doors clicked open at his approach. The guards didn't even look at him. It was as if his presence was a ghost in their programming. He reached Julian's penthouse with an impossible ease. The elevator ascended silently, whisking him into a realm of opulence that smelled of expensive scotch and desperation. When the doors slid open, he found Julian standing by a panoramic window. Julian turned, his face draining of color. He didn't ask how he got in, he knew. He looked at the ledger with the gaze of a condemned man. "I thought you were gone," he whispered. He didn't say a word, just stepped into Julian's space. The mogul began to babble, admitting to stealing the protagonist's inheritance and shifting assets while he was incapacitated in a facility. "I did it to protect you," Julian cried, falling to his knees. "The burden of that wealth would have destroyed you. I took the weight so you could be free." The man looked down at his former friend with icy clarity. He didn't want apologies. He reached out and touched the sleek glass surface of the mahogany desk. Instantly, the monitors began to flicker. Red lines cascaded across the financial dashboards. He wasn't taking Julian's money. He was reclaiming the foundation of his power. He watched as the majority shares dissolved, transferred back into the void of the ledger. Julian's digital empire, built on the back of his betrayal, crumbled in real time. He watched his net worth plummet to zero, the success extinguished by the debt he thought was buried. Before we continue this descent into the shadows of the elite, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The ledger is far from balanced, and the debts are only getting deeper. He left Julian sobbing on the rug, but as he stepped back into the elevator, his phone vibrated. It was a device he didn't remember owning, yet it responded to his touch perfectly. A single notification sat on the screen, a private, encrypted message from a contact labeled simply as Elena, his sister. The ledger listed her with the largest moral debt of all, a vacuum of betrayal that outweighed Julian's billions. The message was brief. "They found me. I'm going under." Elena had gone into hiding, fleeing from a past that was finally catching up to both of them. The hunt was no longer just about money, it was about blood. The rain felt like a cold baptism as I stepped off the ferry. Elena thought she was clever, layering her trail behind shell companies and digital ghosts. But the ledger ignored firewalls. It pulsed in my pocket, a compass of resentment that pointed directly to a secluded villa overlooking the jagged northern cliffs. She was living under the name Isabella Thorne, a ghost hiding in plain sight behind luxury. I didn't need to pick the lock. The electronic gate recognized the signature of my presence and bowed open. I found her on the terrace, staring out at the grey, churning sea. She didn't scream when she saw me. She just closed her eyes, the glass slipping from her fingers and shattering on the stone floor. The confrontation wasn't about the millions she had embezzled, though the ledger showed every cent. It was about the time. While Julian had been building towers, Eleanor had let me rot. She had signed the papers that kept me sedated in that facility, watching through a glass partition as the years were stripped from my life. I stood before her, the ledger open to her name, the ink glowing with a dark light. I told her I had come to collect the interest on my stolen years. Elena began to shake. She pulled a dusty folder from a hidden safe, throwing it onto the table between us. It wasn't full of bank statements, but threats. She hadn't taken the money for herself. Our father had left behind a blood debt to a syndicate that didn't accept bankruptcy. They had threatened to end us both, and Elena had traded my freedom for our survival, using the funds to keep the wolves from our door. A paralyzing moral dilemma settled over me. If I balanced her account now, taking back the wealth that served as her shield, I would be signing her death warrant. Yet as I leafed through the folder, the names of the syndicate members began to align with the names in my ledger. These weren't street thugs. They were the city's highest-ranking officials, the mayor, the chief of police, and the judges who presided over the laws I was now circumventing. Those I considered allies were the architects of my ruin. My focus shifted from the sister who had betrayed me out of fear to the monsters who had profited from her terror. Instead of draining Eleanor's accounts, I used her records of their extortion to initiate a collapse of the corrupt elite. I sat in that villa for 3 days, my fingers dancing across a keyboard as I channeled the ledger's power. I didn't just take their money. I corrupted their foundations. I sent physical bills, breakdowns of every bribe and every cent of blood money they owed. These weren't sent by mail, but by couriers they couldn't track, appearing on their pillows and inside their locked safes. The tension in the city spiked. Society's pillars trembled as documents were leaked to the press. The public, fueled by a decade of hidden resentment, turned into a tidal wave of fury against the people who had claimed to lead them. I watched from the shadows as empires began to preemptively burn their records, but it was too late. The ledger knew the truth, and the truth was being broadcast on every screen in the area. As I prepared to leave, I flipped to the very back of the leather book. My heart stopped. There, tucked into the binding, was a final page I hadn't seen. It wasn't a list of people who owed me. It was a single entry, a debt owed by me to an unnamed benefactor. The description read, "Life reclaimed." The amount was incalculable. Someone had bought me back from the grave, and the ledger I held wasn't a gift of fate. It was a loan I hadn't yet begun to pay. I was no longer the master of this game. I was merely a player in a much larger transaction. The address for the final settlement was etched into my mind long before I reached the city's oldest bank. It was a fortress of stone, a temple where the concept of value had been guarded for centuries. I walked through the oak doors, the ledger heavy against my ribs. It didn't pulse with the frantic energy of a collection. It hummed with a low vibration. The CEO was waiting for me in an office that felt more like a cathedral than a boardroom. He was an old man, his skin like parchment and his eyes reflecting a sharp clarity. He simply gestured to a chair and waited. He explained that the ledger was never meant to be a weapon for personal vendettas. It was a tool of social engineering, a mechanism designed to balance the scales of power every 50 years when greed became a rot. I was chosen for my proximity to the ruin, to fully settle my own debt, the price of my resurrection from that grave. I was told I had to sign over my identity. I would become the next keeper of the ledger, a ghost moving through the shadows to ensure no single empire grew too large to fail. "To save your sister," the CEO whispered, "you must cease to exist." The decision was interrupted by the intrusion of the world outside. The corrupt officials, the remnants of the syndicate I had been dismantling, had reached their breaking point. They didn't want a reset. They wanted their crimes erased. A hit squad armed with tactical gear breached the lobby below. I could see them on the security monitors. Professionals moving with intent. They weren't just coming for the money, they were coming to burn the truth. I looked at the CEO, then back at the ledger. I realized then that my status wasn't just about influence. It was about control over the infrastructure of their lives. As the gunmen moved through the corridors, I didn't reach for a weapon. I reached for the pulse of the bank. With a series of entries into the ledger's final pages, I initiated a total freeze of the syndicate's assets. In the middle of their assault, their encrypted comms turned to static. The biometric locks on their rifles engaged, rendering their weapons useless. Their transport vehicles, keyed to accounts that no longer existed, died in the street. They were rendered powerless not by lead, but by the sudden evaporation of their financial reality. In that victory, I made my final choice. I didn't sign the contract. Instead, I turned to the page dedicated to Elena. I didn't just forgive her debt. I wiped her record clean, transferring the billions I had reclaimed from the corrupt elite into a blind trust for the victims of their extortion. I produced a lighter. The CEO's eyes widened with horror. I touched the flame to the book. The pages curled and blackened, the names turning into ash. I told the old man that no person should have the right to own the lives of others, regardless of the balance. I walked out of the bank as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the skyline in shades of purple. I was a ghost now, my bank accounts empty, and my name erased from every record. I was penniless, but for the first time since I woke up in that sterile room, I was truly free. I spent the evening on a park bench, watching the city rebuilding from the ashes of the financial war I had started. A young child wandered away from his mother and approached me. He didn't speak, but he held out a rectangular object wrapped in brown paper. I took it, my heart stopping as I felt the familiar texture of leather. I opened it to find a ledger. On the first page, written in fresh ink, was my name. The cycle had not ended. It was waiting for a hand to write future.